Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world one book at a time. Today, we are undertaking a deep dive into radical personal and ideological transformation, and our guide is a collection of excerpts from the Autobiography of Malcolm X, as told to Alex Haley.
Yeah, in this book, it's so much more than just a biography. It's really a foundational text for understanding how the systems of 20th century America, we're talking everything from racism and poverty to the prison system, how they all came together to forge one of its most potent and, frankly, revolutionary figures.
So the core question we're really exploring here is, how does that happen?
Exactly. How do these systems of racial exclusion, of poverty, incarceration, and then later, this radical belief structure,
Yeah.
how do they shape and catalyze such profound personal and ideological transformation?
It's like his life is a perfect case study.
It is. It's a case study of how external structures, even the ones designed specifically to marginalize and crush someone, can provide the very mechanisms for their intellectual, their spiritual, and their political evolution. It's a painful blueprint, but it's a necessary one to understand systemic causation.
And his journey, it just reflects these extreme pressures, but also these volatile opportunities for radical change that were, I guess, inherent in American systemic failure during that time. So our mission today isn't to praise the man or to take a political side. It's really to understand the forces he was navigating. What were the inputs? And given that environment, what were the inevitable outputs?
Precisely. Our approach is purely a systems-level analysis. We are looking at the mechanisms.
Okay.
So things like the constant environment of white supremacist violence he grew up in, the functioning of the penal system that literally confined him,
Right.
and then the very strict parallel structure of this alternative religious movement that, in his view, redeemed him. We're looking at what produced the outcomes described in his life.
So we want to understand the machinery.
We want to understand the engine that built and then rebuilt this man over and over again.
So the man at the center of this incredible story, he was born Malcolm Little. He later becomes El-Hajj Malik el-Shabazz.
Right.
And he was, first and foremost, a political and religious figure. He articulated the anger, the struggle, and the beliefs of African Americans in the 1960s with a kind of clarity and a fervor that made him, without question, one of the most controversial and, to the white establishment, one of the most feared black men of his time.
And the book itself, it's an established, essential classic of modern American literature. It's the result of this really unique and intense collaboration with the writer Alex Haley.
Haley's role must have been so challenging.
Oh, incredibly. He was brought on to tell the intimate details of Malcolm X's entire life, but he was told to act strictly as the writer, not an interpreter.
So just the facts.
Just the facts. And what's so fascinating about how the text was created is this inherent tension. Malcolm X was constantly vigilant. He was profoundly afraid of surveillance.
Which was probably justified.
Oh, absolutely. And he was obsessively dedicated to crediting Elijah Muhammad, the leader of the Nation of Islam, even when he was discussing the most personal parts of his own journey.
That must have created a real conflict for Haley then, trying to capture this raw, dead honesty that the final book is praised for, while his subject was still loyal or maybe psychologically bound to the really rigid structure of the NOI.
Absolutely. Haley actually recounts how Malcolm X would often edit his own recollections in real time.
Wow.
Yeah, just to make sure they properly reflected the NOI doctrine. He only really loosened up and started speaking more frankly toward the very, very end of their collaboration after his own ideological rupture.
So the book itself kind of transformed along with him?
In a way, yes. Yet despite that initial self-censorship, the finished book manages to convey this passionate, crucial truth about race and racism in our times that honestly few others have matched. It's really a testament to the power of a life lived relentlessly in search of truth.
For this deep dive, we've selected excerpts specifically to trace that central through line of transformation. We want to do it in plain language. So we're essentially mapping his trajectory through these distinct phases, almost like chapters in a life. You have his early life under systemic violence and economic constraints.
Hustler years that followed.
Right. Then this completely unexpected intellectual and moral awakening that happens inside the state prison system.
Which is just an incredible paradox.
It is. Then his meteoric rise as a minister in the Nation of Islam, the devastating ideological break that followed, and then his final world-shifting turn toward global human rights advocacy after his pilgrimage to Mecca.
And we really have to anchor this in its historical context.
Yeah.
This is mid-20th century America. And the sheer just
Yeah.
The pervasive nature of racism has to be understood. We're not talking about something subtle. We're talking about the constant physical threat of violence from groups like the Ku Klux Klan and the Black Legion.
It was baked into the system.
Completely. The
Yeah.
systematic denial of basic civil and economic rights, and the profound economic hardship that trapped huge numbers of black communities in what the sources rightly call the lower depth.
It was a world where opportunities were just structurally denied from the start.
Precisely. And this context highlights the dual role of these institutions. You have the criminal justice system, which was already disproportionately affecting black men. It was a system of removal and constraint.
Okay.
But at the same time, you have these burgeoning alternative religious movements like the NOI that emerge. And they offer a radical identity, moral discipline, and self-reliance in places where the established white systems only offered poverty, subservience, and spiritual degradation.
So they were filling a vacuum.
They were filling a massive vacuum.
And what truly defines this text, I think, the idea that has to stay with you as we analyze these systems, is that central through line. His life is a testimony to the raw power of redemption.
Yeah.
It's the sheer, unyielding force of a human personality to overcome these monumental systemic constraints. He moved, as he put it, from the very bottom of white society's mud to a position of international prominence, and he was constantly challenging every single limiting label that was placed on him.
So let's unpack some of the core ideas here.
Okay, let's do it. Let's get into 5 major ideas that the excerpts reveal and show how his life stages connect directly to the structure of these social systems, the mechanisms, and the feedback loops that result.
The first core idea, and it's one that really defines his later political position,
Yeah.
is Malcolm X's own belief that his trajectory into crime and later into radicalism. It wasn't random.
He felt it was inevitable.
He felt it was an inevitable outcome, a kind of structural destiny created by the American social and economic environment for black youth.
And the sources illustrate this so starkly with the tragedy around his father, Reverend Earl Little. He wasn't just a preacher. He was a dedicated organizer for Marcus Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association, the UNIA. He was actively preaching black nationalism, the Back to Africa cause.
Which, at the time, was an incredibly provocative stance to put a massive target on his back. We learned he had already seen 3 of his 6 brothers killed by white men, one of them lynched. It established violence as this family legacy of systemic persecution.
So this mechanism of systemic violence, it wasn't some historical abstraction for him. It was daily reality.
It was a consistent force. His childhood was defined by this recurring nightmare of threats. Hooded Klansmen surrounding their home in Omaha, shattering windows, shouting warnings against his father for spreading trouble.
And it didn't stop.
It didn't. Later, the threats came from the Black Legion in Lansing, Michigan. They wore black robes instead of white. This wasn't just about fear. It was physical, systematic intimidation designed to break that family unit.
And then when his father died, violently hit by a streetcar, though the community whispered he'd been attacked and laid on the tracks,
Right.
the systemic failure shifts. It goes from physical violence to this kind of economic malice. Tell us about the insurance mechanism here, because this is where the system really comes in to degrade the family.
It's just, it's cynically brilliant in a way.
Mhm.
Reverend Little had a substantial insurance policy designed to protect his large family, but the company successfully balked at paying out the larger sum.
Oh.
They claimed it was suicide. They used this spurious finding that because he was struck by a moving vehicle, he must have jumped in front of it, and they used that to avoid their contractual obligation. This denial of economic protection was absolutely devastating.
That is just profound. It forces you to see the economic system functioning as an adjunct to the violence. So the murder or the death removes the income earner.
And the insurance industry removes the safety net. And this systemic denial, it forced his proud, dignified mother, Louise Little, onto state welfare. Malcolm X watched this system of charity utterly degrade his mother's self-respect and her sanity.
He talks about that with such pain.
He does. He saw welfare officials acting as if they owned us, coming to the house, questioning the children, and treating the family, in his words, not as people, just things. It stripped them of their dignity. And this constant intrusive psychological degradation, it fueled his later aggression and his skepticism toward any white-controlled institution.
So the lesson he took from this early life was corrosive, but I guess maybe pragmatic for survival.
I think that's the right word.
He remembered observing how his older brother Wilfred, who was nice and quiet, often stayed hungry.
Right.
But Malcolm himself learned early on that crying out in protest could accomplish things. Or, more simply, that Making noise, being aggressive, demanding results. That's what got attention.
It taught him that compliance was starvation and aggression was survival. And that lesson, it set him on the path to becoming a hustler in his teenage years, someone who never wanted to wait for anything. That desire for immediate results, born from the desperation of poverty and systemic denial, that became a defining characteristic of his street identity.
Which then leads directly into the next major system that took control of his life, the criminal justice system.
Exactly. And while it constrained him physically, took him off the streets for 7 years, it paradoxically provided the absolute necessary environment for his intellectual and spiritual awakening.
It is astonishing. The system designed to punish and remove him ends up being the very system that creates the intellectual groundwork for his radical ministry.
Yeah. He was initially incarcerated in the Charlestown State Prison, which he describes as a dungeon.
Built in the 1800s, right?
Right, like the 1805-era Bastille.
Yeah.
Cramped cells, no running water, covered pails for toilets.
Yeah.
Just abysmal.
And he describes himself as just spiraling.
Completely. Physically miserable and as evil-tempered as a snake. He earned the nickname Satan because of his constant anti-religious attitude. The environment was physically oppressive, but that constraint was the key. It forced him into a discipline of intellectual inquiry that the chaotic street life never allowed.
So tell us about that mechanism of self-education, because the level of dedication he had is almost legendary.
It is. The forced time allowed him to develop this astonishing discipline for intense reading. He famously requested a dictionary and just read it, cover to cover, page by page.
The whole thing.
The whole thing. He was developing his vocabulary, his penmanship, his reading comprehension to a level that just far exceeded his formal education. The sources even mention he developed astigmatism from reading so much by the faint lights-out glow coming from the corridors.
That physical cost just illustrates the sheer intellectual hunger he must have felt.
He transformed the physical constraint into intellectual freedom. It's a profound shift.
And it wasn't just solitary reading, was it?
No, prison became his baptism into public speaking. He joined the prison colony's weekly debating program. He realized all that intense reading had his mind like steam under pressure, and he needed an outlet. He found speaking before an audience was as exhilarating as the discovery of knowledge through reading had been.
And his technique was aggressive, right? It reflected that early life lesson.
Absolutely. He'd research his opponent's position just so he could knock down those points. And he was always working in his growing political ideology, frequently finding a way to argue the devilishness of the white man, even in debates about, ancient history.
Which then created this pertinent feedback loop for the Nation of Islam.
The perfect feedback loop, the NOI message, the white man is the devil. It found the black convict most perfectly preconditioned to accept it.
Because it matched their experience.
It instantly validated their lifelong experience of being kicked about by the white system, being arrested, unfairly judged, and then confined. The radical theology just made sense.
So the system was literally feeding its own opposition.
Yes. Black men in prison embraced the teachings rapidly because the diagnosis perfectly echoed their empirical reality. The constraint of the CJS created the ideal environment, both the intellectual crucible and the preconditioned audience, for this radical alternative system to thrive.
So once he's converted and released, the Nation of Islam becomes this all-encompassing system. It's a complete parallel society.
It really was. It functioned as this revolutionary structure that sought to heal the mental and spiritual sickness that he believed was caused by white society. It provided its members with self-worth, identity, and this intense moral discipline.
And the core mechanism of that system was this radical moral reform, enforced by a really strict puritanical code.
Extremely strict. I mean, think about the vices that afflicted the depressed Negro mass in the ghettos.
Yeah.
The NOI explicitly banned pork, alcohol, tobacco, narcotics, gambling, dating, dancing.
It was a total rejection of the established culture and the accepted ways of coping with despair.
It was a mechanism of physical and moral purging. And this adherence to an impeccable personal life was held up as the supreme model of human redemption. It provided immediate structure and demonstrated palpable, measurable success in reversing the consequences of that systemic degradation.
And their recruitment strategy reflected this systems-level approach, right? They weren't focused on the middle class.
No, not at all. The strategic mechanism was ruthlessly effective. Go after the black man in the mud. Elijah Muhammad recognized that ex-addicts and ex-cons, the very people mainstream society had just thrown away. They often made the best Muslims because they had hit rock bottom and desperately sought total structure.
And the NOI offered that structure, but it was coupled with genuine respect, which was key.
Crucially, yes. They offered genuine affection and respect. They were addressing former hustlers and addicts as brother or sir. They were providing the community and the confidence necessary to kick their habits.
And it worked.
It worked. This strategy resulted in a phenomenal success rate in dope addiction cures, something no government program or traditional church was achieving. The system worked because it rebuilt the man from the moral ground up.
And a system like that has to provide a new identity to replace the shattered one.
It had to. The NOI replaced the false label of Negro, which they saw as a label forced by the slave master, with this glorious, empowering origin story. You're a member of the Asiatic nation, from the tribe of Shabazz.
And this is where the theology of Jacob's history comes in.
Yes, for a brief explanation, the NOI taught Jacob's history, which is a theological narrative claiming that white people were an inferior race created by a scientist named Jacob. This black superiority doctrine was designed explicitly to instill self-respect and to counter the psychological degradation imposed by centuries of white supremacy.
So the system was totally comprehensive. You had the fruit of Islam, the FOI, enforcing the moral laws.
Right. And the Muslim girls training, the MGT, and the general civilization class, the GCC, teaching women how to keep homes and rear children. It was a self-contained, total political and social structure.
Which brings us to this fascinating and, I guess, dangerous paradox involving the media system.
Yeah, this part is wild.
The white communications media, while universally intending to discredit and attack the NOI, acted as an unintentional amplifier. It vaulted the movement from obscurity from their little storefront temples to national and even international prominence.
It's a stunning example of a feedback loop going completely contrary to the system's intent. They thought they were destroying him.
So how did they amplify something they actively sought to destroy? What was the mechanism?
Well, the mechanism was shock value, and the media's necessity of finding this confrontational counter-narrative to the mainstream civil rights movement.
Right, they needed a foil.
They needed a foil. Programs like the 1959 documentary The Hate That Hate Produced fixed that controversial black Muslim label in the public mind. And media outlets, both white and black, just use these inflammatory terms. Hate teachers, demagogues, black supremacists, violence seekers.
But wasn't the media successful in characterizing him as a figure of hate? How did that not backfire with the wider public?
Well, for the white public, it largely worked. They saw hate. But for the black masses, the narrative was completely inverted. This external hostility created a powerful reinforcing feedback loop for NOI recruitment and for Malcolm X's own credibility. The more the press and the mainstream civil rights leaders, who Malcolm X often dismisses Uncle Tom's serving white interests, the more they attacked him, the more trust he gained from the black masses and intellectuals.
Because they saw the attacks as evidence of his uncompromising position.
Precisely. They saw his ruthless honesty, his uncompromising stand against white power, and they sensed that he would never betray them, unlike the Negro Progress organizations that he argued had white bosses pulling the real strings behind the scenes.
So the outside pressure just validated the internal NOI narrative.
It validated the righteousness and the victimhood narrative completely. Every televised interview became a recruiting tool.
He became a national figure.
Absolutely. He was able to confront interviewers who suddenly became, in the eyes of his followers, these breathing, living devils on the phone or TV. His technique became nonstop. He would just force his message in until he had said what he wanted to say, arguing that America was reaping what it sowed. And this media cycle didn't just increase the NOI's visibility. Significantly, it boosted the percentage of educated Negroes joining the movement, expanding their reach far beyond just the bottom-of-the-pile Negroes.
And then the final crucial transformation, the ultimate challenge to his entire belief system, it came when international travel, specifically the pilgrimage to Mecca and trips to Africa, acted as this powerful corrective system. This experience just dismantled the rigid racial dogmatism he had preached for 12 years.
This is where you see the true force of transformation revealed. I mean, for over a decade, his life was defined by the certainty that the white man is the devil.
It was his core principle.
It was everything. And the mechanism of Mecca, the Hajj, it was overwhelming because it presented him with empirical data that directly contradicted his core ideological structure.
So what did that reality look like? What was the shock?
He described seeing men with skin tones ranging from blue-eyed blondes to black-skinned Africans all praying together, in true brotherhood to the same God. He witnessed people whom he had previously labeled as devils, demonstrating the very purity and mutual respect that his own organization promised but rarely delivered on such a global, colorblind scale.
That must have caused an immediate, devastating ideological earthquake for him.
It was an immediate crisis. It forced a fundamental ideological shift that was necessary for his evolution. He realized that white man was not a complexion, not some inherent biological evil.
But an attitude.
It was a specific, destructive attitude racism that was developed and ingrained in the Western world. He saw men with the bluest of blue eyes whose white attitude was removed from their minds by the religion of Islam.
And that realization requires a profound level of humility and intellectual honesty, doesn't it? I mean, he dedicated his life to teaching one absolute truth, and the world just showed him a different one.
It led to his profound psychological and spiritual divorce from the NOI's racial doctrine. And he immediately emphasized that he had to rearrange much of my thought patterns previously held and to toss aside some of my previous conclusions.
He didn't hide from it.
No, and he stresses this wasn't easy. It was dangerous and painful. But he remained a man who tries to face facts and to accept the reality of life as new experience and new knowledge unfolds it. This global experience, it forced him to adopt the intellectual flexibility necessary for an intelligent search for truth, shifting his focus from narrow black nationalism to Pan-Africanism and global human rights.
Okay, so if we take those 5 stages, can we now sort of formally overlay the systems to see precisely where the pressure points were? Let's move beyond the narrative and analyze the institutional structures that both constrained and catalyzed his journey.
For sure. We can trace the influence of 4 distinct systems throughout his life. We begin with the family and early life system.
Right.
The key actor there was his father, Reverend Earl Little, who introduced that pre-NOI black nationalism. But the constant constraint was white supremacist violence, the KKK and the Black Legion. This acted as a consistent, brutal mechanism of racial exclusion that defined his childhood nightmare.
And it ultimately eliminated the family's provider, forcing them into economic dependence.
Right. And the vacuum left by his father's death was then filled by the criminal justice system, the CJS, once he fell into crime. The actors, police, courts, prison officials, their system role was physical and social removal. The constraint was the disproportionate sentencing. 10 years, partly for having white girls involved in his criminal activities, which he saw as proof of judicial bias.
And here's that paradox we discussed. The CJS, through its mechanism of constraint, created the ideal captive environment for the Nation of Islam's recruitment.
Exactly. It took the population that felt most victimized, stripped them of outside distractions, and gave them the forced time and discipline to study the NOI's radical message. The system designed to house criminals was inadvertently housing and incubating revolutionaries.
And next, the Nation of Islam NOI system became his total structure.
The actors there were Elijah Muhammad and the various enforcement and training branches like the FOI and MGT. Its system role was that of a total parallel society offering mental and spiritual reform. The mechanism was that rigorous moral code enforced by the FOI aimed at creating an impeccable personal life.
And the narrative was one of black superiority, a deliberate counter-narrative to white society's degradation designed to instill immediate, intense self-respect.
And then finally, we observe the influence of the global religious and political systems after 1964.
Right.
The actors were Orthodox Muslims in Mecca, African leaders, Arab League representatives. This system served as a powerful external corrective and legitimizer. The mechanism of the Hajj exposed him to true universal brotherhood.
Seeing men who had the white attitude removed by Islam.
Yes, and this experience fueled that dramatic narrative shift. He moved from black nationalism to Pan-Africanism, internationalizing the struggle, and seeking the United Nations as a forum to redefine American racism as a global human rights crime.
So it's important to track how the incentives driving his behavior changed across these dramatically different systems.
Massively. In the early life and hustler phase, the incentives were pure survival. Securing food, he remembered being so poor they would eat the whole out of a donut, and learning that making noise was the only way to get results.
Then during the NOI phase, the incentives completely shifted.
Totally. They became focused on moral and spiritual redemption, collective group identity, certainty, and selfless dedication to the messenger of Allah. Money just ceased to be a primary motivator. He was defined by this puritanism and selflessness, which was a direct, powerful reaction against the moral chaos of his hustler years.
And in the final phase, after the break.
In the final phase, the driving incentive became this comprehensive search for truth and justice for all humanity. Recognizing his responsibility to challenge American racism and the sociological dynamite he saw building in the ghettos, even if it meant risking his life daily.
And let's just revisit that powerfully effective reinforcing feedback loop that fueled the NOI's growth for a
Yeah.
second. You have NOI preaching white media attack, hate, white liberals condemn black masses, see uncompromising honesty, black membership increases, and back to NOI preaching. Every external attack just validated the NOI's core teaching.
It did. That the white society was fundamentally evil and irredeemable. It strengthened internal cohesion and expanded their membership base. The external hostility was literally the fuel for the internal narrative reinforcement.
But we also have to acknowledge the rupture and constraint inherent in the NOI system itself.
Yes, the system was based on this absolute moral superiority and purity. That rigidity eventually clashed violently with the reality of Elijah Muhammad's own secular practices and immorality,
Including having children with his secretaries.
which was a devastating plot twist for Malcolm.
It shattered the moral mechanism.
Completely. The contradiction shattered his faith. It led to a profound psychological and spiritual crisis that made it impossible for him to remain loyal to the leader while upholding the strict moral discipline that had initially saved him. He had to face the system's failure, leave, and form new organizations to continue his work without compromising the integrity he had worked so hard in prison to achieve.
And it is astonishing how his analysis, forged in the heat of these mid-century systemic crises, offers these sharp patterns that are so directly relevant to modern discourse.
The pattern of tokenism that he critiqued remains central to contemporary debates about surface-level versus deep structural change. He called integration a foxy northern liberal's smokescreen.
A monumental farce.
Yeah. He was intensely critical of the 1954 Supreme Court decision, arguing it used trickery and magic because it told Negroes they were technically desegregated, but then gave whites loopholes like freedom of association to maintain separation.
Which speaks directly to modern critiques of policies that prioritize superficial diversity over actual, tangible economic and institutional power shifts.
That's the key distinction. His argument that segregation is that which is forced upon inferiors by superiors, whereas separation is that which is done voluntarily by two equals, that remains a key point in debates about self-determination and group economics today.
He argued that as long as black people were dependent on the white man for jobs, education, housing, they would always be controlled.
Right, allowing segregation to persist under the guise of integration.
And his warning about the volatility of the northern inner cities is just, it's particularly chilling when you look at it through the lens of recent decades.
His warning about the sociological dynamite building up in northern ghettos was prophetic. He described this toxic combination of high unemployment, bad housing, inferior education as a self-fusing explosive condition that spontaneously combusts from within itself.
And that warning, delivered over half a century ago, is directly relevant to recurring urban crises and riots.
It highlights that the underlying racist malignancy has been too long unattended, and the systemic deprivations just continue to create these pressure cooker environments.
And his experience forces us to view the prison system not just as a place for punishment, but as an active political space.
For sure. The systemic failure embedded in the CJS, which he argued was responsible for producing the black criminal in the first place, is still profoundly relevant.
Yeah.
The very high rate at which black men in prison embraced Islam then, and analogous political or ideological movements now.
It reflects the system's ongoing failure.
It reflects a failure to provide justice or opportunity for what he called bottom-of-the-pile Negroes. It's a sign of a profound ideological vacuum. The prison system continues to act as this crucial incubator for alternative political movements, precisely where mainstream society has failed to provide a viable social contract.
It's that painful paradox again.
It is. The very act of physical constraint forces deep introspection and radical political development. His famous quote captures it: "I'd put prison second to college as the best place for a man to go if he needs to do some thinking."
And the sources also reveal this powerful appeal of moral extremity in response to extreme societal conditions. His final realization sums this up with astonishing directness.
The quote, "You show me a black man who isn't an extremist, and I'll show you one who needs psychiatric attention." This highlights a crucial pattern relevant to modern radicalization. When the problem, like racism or systemic violence, is severe and uncompromising, a response or a diagnosis that is equally extreme will resonate powerfully. It validates the lived experience of the marginalized community.
So if a problem is extreme, the solution or the diagnosis has to feel equally extreme to be commensurate with the depth of the injury.
Exactly. This pattern of radicalization born out of structural necessity and the failure of moderate solutions remains a potent global force today wherever these social and economic vacuums exist. People seek certainty and discipline when their world is chaotic and unjust.
And then there's the system of public memory.
Right. Malcolm X's identity was continuously fluid, constantly evolving, yet much of the press and the public focused intensely on the rigid initial black Muslim image. They struggled to convey his ultimate flexibility and shift in attitude after Mecca.
They preferred the easily labeled, static figure of Malcolm X, the hate preacher.
Yes. And this speaks volumes about the modern system of public memory, which often prefers these static, consumable labels, the angry, fiery chief Malcolm X, over the complex, changing truth of the man, El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz.
His later life was defined by the realization that transformation matters infinitely more than static labels.
I mean, he even stated that since Mecca, his dearest friends included Christians, Jews, Buddhists, Hindus, agnostics, and even atheists, which demonstrates a profound ideological expansion that the press largely failed to convey because it just didn't fit the existing narrative framework.
Okay, let's situate these excerpts within the broader themes of this channel, focusing on how power and perception are shaped by these unseen structures.
Well, his entire life narrative argues powerfully against individual blame for criminality or poverty. He explicitly states that for him to wind up in prison was really just about inevitable because of the toxic society he was exposed to.
He saw his own criminal pursuits not as moral failures, but as outcomes.
Outcomes of a sick systemic environment. He called it having a jungle mind while living in a sociological jungle. And this framing, it compels us to move past simplistic morality plays and to analyze the structural environment, economic deprivation, judicial bias, media manipulation that predetermines certain paths for marginalized populations.
And we have to examine how power operates through belief systems, especially religion. He identified the white man's Christianity as the greatest single ideological weapon for enslaving millions of non-white human beings.
And why was it so powerful? Because it served as a mechanism of control through distraction. It focused black attention on waiting for pie in the sky, heaven in the hereafter, urging patience and meekness.
While the white man enjoyed heaven right here on this earth.
Exactly. That religious narrative functioned as a powerful, nonviolent mechanism of socioeconomic control. And the NOI successfully challenged that ideological power by creating an opposing, highly disciplined institutional structure, one focused on action now.
They showed that institutional power could be built rapidly when focused on self-reliance. He was proud that the NOI was the only black organization that only black people support.
And that counterpower model was itself an ideological weapon designed to instill dignity, self-sufficiency, and economic independence. It challenged the very foundation of the white man's religious and economic control.
And finally, his story is the ultimate example of how identity evolves when assumptions are challenged by experience.
It's a continuous evolution, a testament to the power of empirical knowledge to dismantle long-held assumptions. His evolution was catalyzed by a series of these existential challenges that acted like systemic correction mechanisms.
First, the intellectual poverty of the streets was challenged by education in prison.
Second, his religious faith in the NOI system was challenged by morality when he discovered Elijah Muhammad's hypocrisy. That wasn't just a personal grievance, it was the failure of the system's core operating principle.
And finally, his core racial doctrine, the belief that the white man was inherently a devil, was challenged by reality during his pilgrimage to Mecca.
That was the most dramatic data input of his entire life. And his final philosophy, I'm for truth no matter who tells it, I'm for justice no matter who it is for or against, is the ultimate systemic adjustment to that new empirical data gathered from global experience. It required radical flexibility and courage to walk away from dogma and choose dynamic, continuous self-correction.
So these excerpts, they force us to see Malcolm X differently, not as the static figure of uncompromising hate, but as a man of radical, continuous transformation, constantly seeking empirical truth and adapting his ideology based on experience, despite the danger.
Yeah. His life was a series of intellectual and spiritual divorces from confining systems. First from the street life, then from the prison system, and finally from the dogmatic nation of Islam.
His journey underscores the power of transformation over static identity. He moved from these rigid, racialized labels to a dynamic, human rights-focused vision.
It took his experiences in Mecca and Africa to realize that anger alone can blind human vision, and that flexibility and an open mind are necessary for an intelligent search for truth. He proved that transformation matters more than static labels, recognizing that nothing in life is permanent, not even life itself.
And that final provocative thought he left us with, that he saw the Islam religion as desperately needed in America because it was the one religion that erases from its society the race problem, is so powerful and demands reflection.
He believed the only way to save America from the imminent disaster of racism was for the white man to accept the oneness of God and thus the oneness of man.
Which raises a really important question for you, the listener.
We're left to consider whether any current ideological or political system in America possesses the internal moral force and external global vision necessary to truly combat the racist cancer that Malcolm X diagnosed over half a century ago. Can a system designed to divide ever truly fix the problems caused by that division?
We have been exploring excerpts from the Autobiography of Malcolm X, a unique collaboration between Malcolm X and Alex Haley. We encourage you to read the full autobiography yourselves, support the authors if you found the ideas valuable, or check your local library for free access. This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind Crisis and Perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon. For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description. If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.